Today we're going to talk about class-based views, and in this video we're specifically going to talk about the view that all generic class-based views inherit from, and that is view. I feel it's real important that we actually get a good understanding of class-based views because they are super helpful and do a lot of heavy lifting for you, but oftentimes people misunderstand how they work. So we're going to start from the base view and work our way up. To get started, we're actually going to look at a function-based view, and first thing we'll do is look at our URL. We can see it's a normal URL. It goes to our home.views.view, which is our function-based view. And if we'll jump out and then look at our function-based view, it's a simple function that we declare. We named it view and we're passing it in a request. The rest of this view is actually what you should be doing for every view that you do, so that you give optimal information to those requesting information for each URL that you have. The first thing that we have is all of the HTTP method names that are available to us. We're going to check our request method, and if it's an options request method, then we're going to return a response that is essentially empty, but tells us all of the methods that we have available that we can actually use whenever we call this URL. So if we did a curl and we said, hey, we want to do a post or we want to do a get, when we call the options, it would tell us, hey, these are actually available for us to use. If we were going to use this in production, we would take the HTTP method names and we would actually slim them down to the exact ones that we would normally use. In the case of this view, it would be only get and post, but we would also need to allow options and head, because if you do a get, then head should be available as well. Moving along, if we look at, we're doing request.method.lower, and we're checking if any of that is in our HTTP method name. This would be where we would have our collection of allowed method names, but for this example I just put them all in there, and then if they were, then we would actually go ahead and let it process. In this case we might want to do a get, and so it's like, hey, get is in there, so let's move on to where we're doing our get method, and we're going to return a response that says all the things. And then we also have a post, so if we do a post, it would be an allowed method, and so we could process normally. Other than that, if it's not available after that, then we're going to return a response not allowed, and we're going to give it a collection of the allowed method names. The response not allowed returns a 405, which says that that method is not allowed to be used on this URL. So now that we have an understanding of our view, let's actually do a little bit of using it. So as you can see on the side, we have our server running. So if we'll curl localhost and do it with a post, and we're going to use the I flag to get back header information, you can see at the very bottom there it says all the people. So that means we successfully made a post. We can do it again with our get, and we have all the things. And we can do options, and if you'll notice at the bottom, it returns all of those methods that we had in our list. Finally, if we do trace, since we didn't actually define what we should do with trace, we actually get back a 405 saying that method is not allowed. You can see that both in the response header that we displayed and then also over in our run server as well. Since this is a function-based view, we can actually interact with it with code in a reasonable manner. If we'll go ahead and close our server and open up our view, and then next to that we'll open up our shell so we have something to reference. First thing we're going to do is we're going to import a request factory. This is something we use in testing, but this also will help drive home what exactly happens. We're also going to import our view function as well. To go ahead and show this, we do a type for this view and we get back a function. If we just do our view, we get the result says it's a function from home.views.view. Then we actually, let's go ahead and call our view function with a populated request object. For that, we're going to use factory, call the .get so that it builds a get request from our HTTP request object, and then we get back an HTTP response. If we call that again with content, we get all the things, and if you'll notice in our code, we ask for it to give us back all the things. Do that again with our post, and it returns back for all the people, which is what is in our post. And then, as you can tell, we get our status code as well because it's returning back an HTTP response. So as you can see, it's fairly predictable what's going to happen. This is a normal view that we would write every single day doing our function-based views. But believe it or not, this view that you're looking at is almost exactly what's returned back in a class-based view. It works in the exact same way. It just, a lot of it's a little more hidden from you so that you don't have to deal with it. So the great thing is you get a lot of this boilerplate code right here for free with class-based views. Plus, in my opinion, it keeps the code a little more readable and organized. So with that, let's actually move into doing our class-based view and taking a look at what it takes to do that. Before we actually get started doing our class-based view, I just want to note that we're going to go through this view and we're going to essentially look at everything it does without looking at the actual code of the view. So we're going to poke and prod it and make it do things so that we understand exactly what's going on. Again, the function-based view that we used earlier is almost exactly what is in our class-based view. And in fact, a couple of the pieces I actually copied and pasted from actual Django code. So the first thing let's do is let's go ahead and open up our view again, our views file, and we're going to import our generic view of view, because at the end of the day, this view class is a generic view class that we're going to use, and it is the base for all generic class-based views. So since we're done importing it, we're going to create our first base view class. It's going to inherit from view, and we're just going to use pass so that we can actually run our code. And for the moment, that's all we really need. If we'll go ahead and open up our URL, we're going to import our base view, and then we're going to replace our home.views.view with baseview.asView. The .asView is a class method that is called without instantiation of a new base view object. To see what's going on when we do this, let's go ahead and open up our shell and import our base view. One thing that's interesting is in our URLs file, we're actually using function-based views, but that's exactly what class-based views use as well. The .asView class method actually returns a function. So if we use baseview.asView, we get back the function home.views.baseview. What's happening, the .asView is instantiating a new object of baseview inside of that asView call. It's setting the keyword arguments and the arguments and the request to itself so you can reference it later. And then it's determining what method that we're trying to use with our request, whether it be a get or a post, options head or trace, any of those. And then once it figures out which one it uses, it actually routes it to the correct location. If we'll go ahead and import our request factory so we can generate a populated request object, and we do baseview.asView and pass it a get request, we get back a response. In this case, it's an HTTP response not allowed, which means it's a 405 because we're not actually allowed to use that method because we haven't actually done it. We haven't actually set that up yet. So let's go ahead and do options because that is allowed by default in our class-based views, and we get back a normal response. So now that we've actually run through that in our shell to poke at it with Python, let's actually make a request to our web server. First thing we're going to do is we're going to call a get method, and it's going to return back a 405 method not allowed. We're doing options, and we're going to get a 200 OK, and we're only allowed, if you look at the bottom of the output, we're only allowed to use options on this method. It's a great start, but let's go ahead and add a get method on our view. The get method takes 4 parameters. We need self because it's inside of a class. We use request because the asView is actually going to pass the request parameter that is in every view, and it's going to pass it into this method. And then we're going to do args and kwargs. And this again is going to work very similar to how function-based views are. And then all we're going to do is we're going to return a response. We aren't actually going to call a super method because we're not actually inheriting a get. The only method that our base class actually implements is the options class so that it actually returns it back properly. From there, we need to implement each of our methods ourselves. In this case, we're implementing a get method. So it's incumbent upon us to actually return a real HTTP response. So we're going to save that, and let's go ahead and play with it a little. if we'll go ahead and do a get request, you see we get a 200 OK. If we do a post, we get a 405 not allowed. And if you'll actually look at the bottom there, the only allowed methods are get, head, and options. But you've probably noticed that we haven't actually told it what methods that our class can actually use or not. That's because in the base class, it actually asks itself, hey, do I have any methods on myself that are equal to any of the HTTP methods that can be asked for? In this case, it was able to find a get method, so it says, hey, we can allow get. Since head is supposed to be the equivalent to get, the code actually says, okay, since we have a get, we're also going to have a head method as well, and it just returns back our get method. You can override the head method, but in that case, you're going to need to return an HTTP response and not call a super. So to drive home the point a little more, we're going to call with options, and we have get, head, and options that are allowed methods. And again, we have a 200 OK response. So let's go ahead and add a post method. And then when we jump out and we curl our server, we're going to throw the options at it, and it's going to add post to our list of allowed methods. When we do a get, it's going to be successful, and we do a post, it's going to be successful. So the biggest thing at this point is, how does it know how to get to the get and the post? Well, whenever we use the as view, whenever it returns back that function that Django calls, it does a bunch of things, and one of those things it does is it calls the dispatch method that is in the view. That dispatch method is the part that actually inspects what the request method is on the request, and then if there is a coinciding method on our view. So that dispatch method is called with every single request. So if you have something that needs to be called with every request and processed beforehand, you need to override the dispatch method. We can go ahead and do that now and do a little inspection of stuff that's in our view. In this case, we're going to print out the request method. We're going to print out the HTTP method names, and then we're also going to print out a method of allowed methods, and this actually generates the list of allowed methods based on methods that we have available to our instantiated view. And then finally, we're going to call a super, which we'll call the dispatch method on our base view, and we're going to pass in the same thing, so that it actually continues the process of determining what method to call. If we'll jump back out in our code and we'll actually do a curl, then when we do our get, we list out, hey, it's a get method. These are all of the methods that are available, and then these are all the allowed methods. You can do that with a post as well, and we get back the same information. So now we've done a bit of the integration paths of how your code actually works when calling a web server. Let's go ahead and interact with our view from inside of our code. So let's jump into our shell. We're going to import our base view. First thing we're going to do is we're going to get our as view function, and then we're going to import our request factory and go through the process of calling our view with a request method. As you can see, we get the same output because it's calling that dispatch method. So we get our get and our two collections of methods, and then we also are returned an HTTP response. So this is how you can interact with it in your code. So another way to interact with it, especially if you're going to do testing, is to go ahead and instantiate a new base view object. So if we do that and we call our get method and pass it a request, then we get back our HTTP response. And if we look at the content of that response, it's the hello world, I'm a get. And again, we have our status code as well. So a fun little thing to do is if we'll change our request object to a post, we change to get our content, and we call it, we still get hello world, I am a get. That's because we're directly calling the get method and we're not calling the post method. So when you're calling these directly, realize that you're going to get back what you get back. The only thing we're doing is passing in the request object, which it was expecting. But since in our dispatch it actually did all the figuring out where to go, once we're in our get method, it doesn't really care what the method of that request is. So if we change this to a post and we call it again, we get back our post. So with that, that's really it on using the base view. So to do a quick rundown overview of everything you just saw, how a class-based view works using our base view is you create a new class-based view, you inherit from view in this case, and then you put in the code that you want to use. You go into your URLs and you do baseview.asView, and then when Django runs everything, that asView returns back a function just like our normal function-based views. In there, it's going to pass in a request like normal. It's going to pass in arguments or keyword arguments that were used in our URL. From there, that function that was passed in, that was created from our class-based view, is going to set the request object to self.request. It's going to set those arguments and keyword arguments to self.args and self.quargs respectively. And then it's going to look at itself and determine whether the method that is on the request object is actually available in the view class. If it is, it's going to call that method. So in our case, we were using get and post. It says, hey, this has a request.post, and we have a self.post, so we're going to call it. It has a method of request.get, and we have a self.get, so let's call that method. However, if it doesn't, it's going to return a 405 of the method not allowed. And then if you call options, it's actually going to return back the collection of all of the allowed methods where it did the introspection to see, hey, these are all the HTTP methods that exist. These are all the methods that we have, and here's the intersection, so we'll show those as being allowed to use. I encourage you to take some of this code and play with it. I also encourage you, now that you have an understanding of how the view class works, to actually go ahead and look at the code in the Django core code. It's not very daunting if you look at just view, and you can actually learn a number of things if you'll actually look at it and play with it and just read through the code. It offers a great building block that I recommend everyone goes through. So with that, I hope you have learned a lot, and I hope you'll join us in one of our next videos where we'll build on this information and look at the template view.